Thank you very much, Porrick, and it's very hard to follow the two previous speakers. And I'd like also to thank Joe for his invitation and for this very topical subject at this time. I was reminded of the Brexit referendum by what I believe it was originally Montaigne, but it was constantly quoted by the head of cabinet of the first president of the European Council, Herman Van Rompuy. And he always said, and it sounds much better in French, une idée complexe, simple et fausse l'emporte toujours sur une idée complexe et juste. That probably doesn't need translation, but basically a simple wrong idea always wins out over complex, more justified ideas. This referendum was a very poignant one for me at several levels. Firstly, because I am, as you can hear from my accent, partly British. In fact, I feel very European because I'm partly British, partly Irish, and half Italian. But I do feel, you know, when you've worked 37 years from the European Parliament, and I was recruited originally from a job in the United Kingdom, it almost feels like a kind of repudiation of my long career in the European institutions, working with all the other nationalities. And it feels much more so for some of my recently retired and still currently working British colleagues in the European Parliament who feel in a very, very awkward position because of this vote. At a second level, after I retired, I had to go and do a little bit of business in London, and I decided I would spend a few days campaigning in the referendum. And that was poignant too, because firstly, campaigning with a group of like-minded people was in a way very attractive, but it also showed that the divisions that this referendum has opened up are not just with Northern Ireland and with Scotland and England, but within England, that the part of London where I campaigned in actually ended up voting 85% Remain. And the whole borough, the whole area, the wider area in which it was located, including working class areas, which voted 70% Remain, just showed the huge divisions between London and the rest of England. And the third poignant thing is just working, as Porrick had said, with colleagues from all the other member states. And I've spoken to quite a few of them, firstly during the campaign and now more recently since the result. And they're bemused by the result, and of course they're very worried about the impacts on their own member states. So what I thought I would do today is very briefly talk about the reactions to the Brexit referendum in some of the other EU countries. I can't be comprehensive. I know some of them better than others, but just to give a bit of a flavour of that. Secondly, talk a little bit about the UK legacy on the European Union. I think a subject not to be neglected. And then finally, where next for the EU in terms of its future structure, power relationships and policy choices. So in terms of reactions to the Brexit referendum in other EU countries, do Europeans feel better without the UK? The answer is clearly no. The UK departure has been regretted by, I think, all member states to a greater or lesser extent, and for a variety of different reasons. In some cases, it's because they felt that they had similar policy interests or overall approach to the economy, liberal and free trade compared to a more protectionist approach. In some, because they shared the more pragmatic rather than federalist views on future European Union development. In others, recognition that the European Union had brought a lot to the table in such areas as its economy, its global security, reach, and so on. Then there were those who were concerned with that old historical emphasis on the balance of power within Europe, those who've seen the UK as a counterweight to traditional Franco-German axis or more recent German predominance. Then there were, of course, there's the fear that Brexit would stoke up domestic arguments and encourage their own nationalists and Eurosceptics to call for new referenda. Of course, there have always been some who've said the UK is a very awkward partner and it would be better to get rid of it and we'll get on better without it. But that has been very much a minority view. Now, I'm obviously have to treat all kind of opinion polls with research thing with some skepticism, but I looked at a couple of very interesting research. One by an American company, the Pew Research, which did some research just in the lead up to the referendum, and then another one just done in the last few days by a French foundation, the Fondation Jean Jaurès. The Pew research was very interesting because it showed the very unfavourable view of the EU in most of the countries surveyed. So a real wake-up call to all of us about that the European Union is not in a good place. And including in some countries like Greece and France, where there were fewer favourable views of the EU than in the UK. But in spite of this, only 16% of those surveyed by Pew in the 10 countries that they looked at said that it would be a good thing if UK left, compared to 70% who felt it would be bad. And it was, unsurprisingly, almost 90% of Swedes, 75% of Dutch and Germans felt it would be very, very bad if the UK left. But even in France and Italy, it was around 60%, clear majority that it would be a bad thing. There's a bit of a French paradox in the sense that France, according to these polls, is one of the most Eurocritical countries, has one of the strongest nationalistic political forces. But it was also the one with the highest percentage, 32%, believing that it might be a good thing for the UK to leave. Whether those were federalists or old-style Gaullists, I don't know. But they were still, the important thing is that even in France, where there was this strong minority view, they were easily outnumbered by those who felt that the UK should stay. The other study I mentioned was by the Jean Jaurès Foundation. That's even more interesting because it was taken in the biggest EU member states after the referendum. And they asked questions such as, did you understand the reasons why the British voted to leave or not? And interestingly, Germany was by far the country with the highest percentage of people who didn't understand why the UK left. It was 45% of Germans compared to only 22% of French and 18% of Italians. Italians, interestingly enough, I need to look into this more, were the most divided because they had the highest percentage of those who said that they did understand the UK vote, but also the highest percentage of those who were saddened and angry by the outcome. So how serious for the EU was another question, and the country which felt it was very serious was Poland, had by far the highest vote in that respect. 54% of Poland's felt it was extremely serious for the EU, only 25% in Germany, and then much lower, only 13% in France. And not so serious, France was the highest figure and Poland was the lowest. And will the EU be strengthened by this crisis? Interestingly enough, Germans felt that the EU would rebound. Over 50% of Germans felt that, and half of Spaniards, but a lower percentage of French and Italians. It's interesting to look at the German point of view, because the German view of EU membership appears to have become more positive since the referendum. I think if you look at some other countries, including some of the more Eurosceptic ones, interesting to look at the immediate aftermath of the Brexit referendum. Perhaps the chaos, the political chaos which has been referred to in the UK, the market reaction and so on. It's interesting to see that in these very early days, and it's too early to say that this is very meaningful, but several countries are less keen on having a referendum in their own country and more pro-EU than they'd been before. For example, in Denmark, there was a big swing towards should the Denmark remain in the EU. It was 60% before, and it's gone up to 70% after the referendum. Do you want a referendum if the UK leaves? It was very, very narrow. It was 40% to 40 in favour to 45% against before the UK vote, and it swung in Denmark to 32% in favour to 57% against. Similarly in Finland and in other countries like Croatia, which, although it's a new member state, is rather Eurosceptic, and there's been absolutely no upsurge of Eurosceptic views. In fact, quite the opposite. So in terms of will there likely to be a copycat referendum, difficult to say. I don't know what the situation is in the Netherlands, which is maybe the country most vulnerable to it, ironically, one of the founder member states. But in Denmark, the Danish People's Party, the rather large right-wing party in Denmark, has said that they want to wait the outcome of EU-UK negotiations before calling for a possible referendum. So they've given no specific date or deadline. But if it was a good result, then maybe they might call for a referendum. Similarly, in Finland, where the right-wing party, the Finns party, which is now in government, their youth wing has already called for a citizens' initiative for a similar referendum in Finland. But the party leader, who is very, very dominant in that party, has said there will be no referendum during the current Finnish parliament, but it might be in his party's manifesto for the 2019 national elections. So I think in terms of disintegration from that point of view, in the countries which are most likely to have a referendum, it's at the moment the main attitude is wait and see. One thing which has certainly had an impact is that the Eurosceptic parties in these countries have clearly been reinforced and given extra oxygen in a whole variety of countries, including Italy with the Lega and the right wing of the former Berlusconi party and so on. They've definitely been reinforced, and the parties I've mentioned in Denmark and Finland, and of course Wilders' party in the Netherlands and the Austrians and so on. And they've also said, and this of course is an understandable point, that like the Hungarians who said Europe must learn the lessons of Brexit, and people's opinion should be heard, even in Brussels. This was the Hungarian foreign minister. A quick word on the impact of the referendum within the UK. I won't talk about the extraordinary political developments which have happened since, but more of the mood that has happened. The Liberal Democrats, which have said that they would put it in their manifesto that they would try and keep the UK in the EU, has gained a lot of members and has actually done some well in some by-elections. What is really interesting is that a number of the people who campaigned in the Remain camp have formed all kinds of groups. There's been a big march. There's going to be another big march in London this weekend. And it's interesting that this very passive view towards the European Union that has been prevalent in the UK for so long, finally, and probably too late, pro-European public opinion in the UK does seem to have been mobilised to some extent. And it'll be very interesting to see whether this energy can be harnessed in any way in the future. And the final point in my first part is we have no idea what the future EU-UK relations are going to be, but will there be a punitive or conciliatory approach? And a lot of countries have come down, not just Ireland, but Germany, Cyprus, and many other countries have said, no, it should be more conciliatory, while others have said, using the coded language of Article 50 should immediately be unleashed, want a tougher approach because of fear of contagion. And it's going to be a very difficult balance to strike. Not too vindictive, but not too favourable either. So a brief word about the UK legacy for the European Union. Was de Gaulle right when he twice vetoed UK membership, saying that it would be an inappropriate member to join? Ironically, in many respects, the UK would have been an ally of de Gaulle in certain issues for Europe in terms of rather reinforcing the Europe of nation states. Perhaps not in terms of Blair's coziness with the US and the Iraq war, where he would have obviously said, I told you so. But in other areas, I think the British approach to Europe would have been more in tune, ironically, with his, even though there have always been different concepts of the European Union in France and the UK. This Europe puissance, Europe as a power in France, and the kind of much more economic approach to Europe in the European economic space approach in the United Kingdom. But in practice, if you look at British influence on the European Union in the years since it's been a member since 1973. It's actually been very great. The emphasis on widening the European Union rather than much closer integration. They have been champions of enlargement, champions of a single market and mutual recognition. I know that from my own experience because I was on the staff of the Economic Committee of the Parliament when Jacques Delors was its chairman before he went into the French government and then to the Commission. And Jacques Delors was extremely impressed by the British members of the committee pushing for a re-emphasis on the uncompleted internal market. The whole thing on better regulation, reducing bureaucracy, the EU needs to be more competitiveness, doing less but more, but better. Freer trade, less protectionism. All these are very much bear a British stamp. And the emphasis also on not just adopting new law, but having much better implementation of what exists. That was also very much a British emphasis. And again, I've seen it from my own personal experience where it was British members of various committees I worked on who put more emphasis on, if we have law, let's make sure it actually works and is properly applied in the member states rather than just constantly adopting new laws. And all kinds of procedural things, such as question time in the Parliament, firstly in the plenary, but even in committee, was very much from British parliamentary practice. So there has been a considerable legacy. Finally, where next for the European Union? I was struck by, during the Brexit campaign, there were two incompatible points of view put forward by UK Brexiteers. Some of them argued that without the United Kingdom there could now be a federal Europe and that the mythical EU superstate could now be created. And then, on the other hand, there were those who argued the British exit could lead to a wider collapse of the European Union and a return to very worthwhile national sovereignty. I mean, both of those were obviously wrong visions. The one which obviously I feel most strongly about is the return to nationalism. In my whole career in the European Parliament, the most moving and powerful speech I heard was François Mitterrand's last speech to the European Parliament. He was dying. He died only a few months later. He could hardly stand at the podium. He was so weak. And he growled out, never ever forget, Madame et Messieurs, nationalisme c'est la guerre. Nationalism means war. And it was incredibly powerful, and it made an extraordinary impact on everyone who heard that speech. On the other hand, the question of, are we moving towards a more federal Europe? It's very much a minority. Of course, there are still federalists in a number of member states. In the Benelux countries, and a number of, in Italy, ironically, they're definitely still there, France and Germany to some extent. But they're very much a minority. I don't think there's any current appetite for a more federal Europe. And in fact, the Pew research I referred to before showed that 42% of those polled wanted powers returned to the member states. 27% supported the status quo, and only 19% wanted the centre to get more power. On the other hand, British exit could well lead to renewed determination for the EU to survive and to regroup, and as I said, not go back to narrow nationalism. Brief word on the balance of power considerations. Obviously, this is a very awkward position for Germany. Helmut Kohl was always very eloquent about that, the thing that Porrick quoted about he wanted a more European Germany, not a more German Europe. And it was absolutely sincere in the aftermath of unification, which made Germany in population and economic size even greater than it was before. And with the weakness of the Franco-German axis and the presumed departure of the UK, that clearly put Germany's position in a more powerful thing, and it's an awkward position. It's very awkward for other big states, including Italy and Spain and Poland. But it also poses the wider question, which is extremely important in the European Union, not just in the Irish context, but in many other countries, when you think how many small and medium-sized countries there are in the European Union, and that is the balance in this union between the big and smaller member states. I won't go into detail because there's so many questions on the potential policy choices for the future. I mean, the fundamental question is, what should the EU be doing in the future or not doing? The less but better, what does that mean in reality? Should there be fewer bits of legislation? Should there be more? Should there be some competencies going back to the member states? And so on. That's obviously one question. Then on economic policy, the balance between the austerity versus more expansionary policy, neoliberal versus more statist approach, approximation of laws or looser mutual recognition. All these are fundamental choices which will have an impact on public opinion in the different member states to a different degree. Obviously, from the Irish perspective, the question of will there now be a greater challenge to Ireland's corporation tax rate? And of course, Ireland is not alone in this. I was struck, I spoke just yesterday to my colleague in Cyprus. They have exactly the same 12.5% rate, and they have exactly the same concerns about what's going to happen now. Social considerations are really important because I think there's been a real feeling in many, many member states that somehow social Europe has been left behind, that there hasn't been enough solidarity, and that there hasn't been enough generosity towards the poorer EU member states. I remember, ironically, for a while, I had a British Conservative chairman of my committee, and she was the committee chair when the big enlargement took place in 2004. And she said, this is the meanest enlargement we've ever had. If you compare what happened when Ireland and when Spain and Portugal joined, much, much less generous approach of the EU in 2004 than before. And that's been reinforced by this constant emphasis of the EU budget should not get any larger. When I started working, people were saying, we're not going to have a federal budget of 20% of GDP or 30%, but maybe we should have a pre-federal budget of 2 or 3%. Ever since then, we've been stuck in the tramlines of only 1% of GDP for the EU budget, and that, of course, has constrained policy choices. There's no sign that that's going to change in the near future, but it's clearly something which will need to be discussed. Budgetary implications. The departure of the UK is going to have a big impact on net contributions and recipients within the European Union, and we need to look at that. Porrick has mentioned the foreign policy and defence projection of the EU and what is going to be relations of the United States with Russia, with Turkey, and also the attitudes of all these countries to the EU without the UK. And then, of course, the gigantic question of an open or closed Europe, the attitude of immigration. David Davis's comments the other day have created great fears in countries like Bulgaria, Romania, and some of the Central and Eastern European countries about the status of their nationals in the UK. And of course, the other side of the coin is the status of the many British residents in other EU countries. 400,000 in Spain alone. Incidentally, a major burden on the Spanish health system. So there's a real impetus to perhaps change the status there. But even Bulgaria, I was amazed. 15,000 British people own second homes in Bulgaria. So, I mean, the ramifications are absolutely huge. And then the big question about democratic accountability and openness. A few and closing comments. At present, the big problem is that there is no clear European Union sense of direction and little obvious leadership. But like Mairead, I'd like to finish on a more optimistic note. I think the European Union is often more resilient than it's given credit for. European Union public opinion can swing back again in the future. And in most EU countries, including the UK, where there was a huge age gap in the referendum, younger people are more positive about the EU and about cooperation with other countries. The EU has perhaps been too cautious in recent years, and it's neither satisfied its own supporters nor has it won over Eurosceptics. It's obviously been very successful as a peace project, but for younger generations of Europeans, the significance of this is less direct. On the other hand, the importance of continued close cooperation between European countries needs to be emphasised more than ever, along with a reminder, as Mitterrand said, of the dangers of nationalism. The fact that the EU has a smaller share of world population and of the world economy is an argument for greater European interdependence and not for European disintegration as advocated by so many Brexiteers. Key objectives like greater competitiveness need to be complemented by a renewed emphasis on solidarity. So finally, it is absolutely vital that the European Union needs to have a clear and open debate about its future purpose and objectives. Thank you very much.